Captain Ibrahim Traoré.
Ibrahim Traoré.
He owned nothing. No palace, no gold, no vast army. Yet when he spoke, an entire nation stood still. When he raised his voice, centuries of silence shattered. This is not a fairy tale. This is the real story of a 35-year-old soldier who challenged the world's most powerful empires with nothing but courage and clarity. In the heart of West Africa lies a land that has long been stripped, drained, and broken. Burkina Faso. Its name once meant land of upright people, but for decades it was a land bowed down by foreign hands and corrupted hearts. The nation's riches were many: gold, cotton, culture, and pride. But none of them truly belonged to the people. For years they watched as foreign companies mined their soil and foreign powers shaped their politics. Presidents came and went, some with promises, others with lies. And then came a name whispered first in camps, then in cities, and finally across continents: Ibrahim Traoré. He was not born into power. He did not seek fame. There was no prophecy written about him, no prediction of a boy who would grow into a symbol. He was a soldier, a captain, one among many. But what made him different was not his rank. It was his refusal to obey silence. Traoré's rise began in shadows. As a junior officer, he watched his people suffer. He saw the terror groups tear through villages while the state offered apologies instead of protection. He heard mothers cry for sons lost in ambushes, and he saw children grow numb to the sound of gunfire. The people's fear had become routine. The government's inaction had become a pattern. But Traoré didn't just see these things, he carried them deeply. In 2022, the people had reached their breaking point. The government had failed. Again, armed groups moved freely and the countryside fell into chaos. The president at the time, Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, had promised reform after seizing power in a coup, but his words dissolved into dust. The people grew tired of waiting. So did the army. And in the silence of that frustration, a quiet plan took form. It wasn't a grand coup. There were no tanks on boulevards or jets screaming across the sky. It was precise, calm, and led by a captain whose voice would soon echo around the world. On September 30th, 2022, Ibrahim Traoré and a group of soldiers removed Damiba from power. Just like that, the captain became the president. But what followed wasn't a parade. It wasn't a celebration. It was a question: who is this man? Is he another uniform with empty promises? Or is he the storm that breaks the chains? Traoré's first speech was not fiery, it was firm. He didn't shout, but he didn't whisper either. He spoke of dignity, of sovereignty, of an Africa tired of begging. He condemned the puppet strings pulled by foreign hands. He promised that Burkina Faso would no longer be a chessboard for powers that play from afar. And perhaps most shockingly, he lived in a simple military camp, not a palace. In a world where leaders are guarded by wealth and distance, Traoré stayed among his men. No convoys, no private jets, just a soldier who now carried the hopes of millions. But hope is heavy, and enemies are many. As Traoré settled into power, he made one thing clear: this was not a seat he sought, but a burden he accepted. And that burden was immense. Burkina Faso was bleeding from within, and it was surrounded by vultures without. Its people had no trust left. Its economy was strangled. Its fields, once green, had turned into war zones. The choice was stark: continue with the illusion of stability or risk everything for real sovereignty. Ibrahim chose the latter, but sovereignty in modern Africa is a dangerous dream. It means challenging deals signed in shadows, confronting allies who act like owners, and breaking away from institutions that promise help but deliver chains. From the moment he took office, Traoré walked into a political storm. Diplomats began watching, embassies whispered, international media painted him with uncertainty, some calling him a nationalist, others a radical. But to many Burkinabés, he was something far simpler: hope. Instead of attending global forums or posing for foreign cameras, Traoré spent his days on the ground. He visited conflict zones in the north, not with a media crew, but with armor. He stood with soldiers who hadn't been paid, listened to villagers who hadn't seen peace in years. He didn't promise miracles. He promised to fight. His policies reflected that. One of his first moves was to demand accountability in military leadership. Generals who lived in comfort while their troops died in ambushes were quietly removed. Corrupt supply chains that siphoned food and weapons away from the front lines were dismantled. In their place, he began rebuilding a national defense from the roots. He launched a mass recruitment campaign, not just for professional soldiers, but for civilian volunteers. Tens of thousands responded. Young men, farmers, even students signed up to protect their land, not because they believed in politics, but because they believed in him. And behind that movement was a simple idea. Burkina Faso must stand on its own feet. It cannot be guarded by outsiders whose interests shift with the wind. It must rise through the hands of its own people. This, of course, came at a price. France, once the colonial master of the region, still held deep ties, military bases, economic contracts, intelligence networks. Traoré's government began asking hard questions. Why are foreign troops stationed here if they can't protect us? Why does our gold leave the country while our children starve? Why do we borrow money with interest to dig wells when our soil is rich enough to build rivers? These questions did not sit well in international rooms lined with suits and strategies. Pressure mounted, aid was suspended, criticism followed. Some headlines called him reckless. Others claimed he was isolating his country. But within Burkina Faso, a new spirit began to grow. Street murals appeared with his face beside Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary icon. School children recited his words. Market women defended him in arguments. Soldiers saluted with pride, not because he had all the answers, but because he had the courage to ask the right questions. Still, courage is not enough in a world ruled by systems. For Traoré, the fight was only beginning. The months that followed were not peaceful. As Traoré pushed forward with reforms, forces both seen and unseen began to resist. The terror groups that plagued the Sahel intensified their attacks. Villages were burned, roads became ambush zones. But this time, the response was different. Traoré didn't retreat to the capital or hide behind bureaucratic language. He returned to the front lines again and again. Images surfaced of the young leader in camouflage, standing shoulder to shoulder with fighters, sometimes barely distinguishable from the men he commanded. His message was clear. If you die, I die with you. If you fight, I fight with you. Burkina Faso will not be saved from behind a desk. But war isn't just fought with bullets. It's fought with ideas, information, and unity. And so, Traoré began another battle, one against dependency. He challenged the very model that had kept countries like his in a state of need. Decades of relying on international aid had not built schools, had not secured roads, had not brought peace. And so he asked, what if we stopped waiting for help? His administration began redirecting state resources, however limited, into national programs, building local infrastructure, training youth in agriculture and construction, and investing in alternative energy for remote communities. Every franc redirected from a foreign contract to a local initiative was a small revolution. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. Traoré also began reaching out, not to former colonizers, but to neighboring nations facing the same struggles. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, countries that had also experienced coups and rejected certain international dictates, became part of a fragile but growing alliance. These weren't military pacts built for aggression. They were survival strategies based on shared history and present threats. Western commentators labeled this group a bloc of defiance. But within West Africa, it began to feel like a resurrection of dignity. Leaders were no longer waiting for approval from across the ocean. They were looking at each other. And in this unity, a greater fear emerged. Fear from those who had grown comfortable with Africa's division. Fear that this new generation of leaders might inspire something larger, an African narrative written by Africans. But Traoré also understood the danger. History is filled with men who spoke of revolution but were consumed by ego. He often invoked the name of Thomas Sankara, not as a slogan, but as a warning. Revolution is not a position, it is a process, and it must serve the people, not the leader. He cut his salary. He refused lavish ceremonies. He traveled with minimal escort. He spoke often, not of his own vision, but of what the people demanded. In every move, he seemed to ask, is this for show or for service? Still, the skepticism remained. Foreign analysts questioned his experience. Others whispered about whether he would turn authoritarian. But while they debated, Burkina Faso continued changing. Not perfectly, not easily, but visibly. Thousands of youth began participating in community patrols. Local radio stations held open forums on security and development. Small farming cooperatives sprang up with state support. It wasn't a miracle, it was a movement. And it was fragile, because behind every hopeful step, there loomed a shadow. The risk that Traoré might be stopped, not just by enemies with guns, but by forces far more subtle. As the months wore on, Ibrahim Traoré found himself not just leading a country, but walking a tightrope stretched across global power lines. Every speech he gave was studied, every policy he passed analyzed for hidden meaning. In the eyes of the world, he was no longer just a captain. He had become a symbol. And symbols, especially in unstable regions, make many people nervous. The pressure came from all directions. Financial institutions offered aid, but with strings attached. Foreign governments offered military support, but with conditions. Media outlets ran op-eds questioning his legitimacy, hinting at instability, suggesting his time was limited. In rooms he was never invited to, strategies were drawn. Some subtle, some sharp. Isolation was not declared, but it was felt. Yet Traoré remained unmoved. He wasn't ignorant of the risks. He simply refused to be driven by fear. A man who stands for truth must first bury comfort, he once said, and he lived by those words. But a country cannot live on ideals alone. The economy groaned under the weight of sanctions and uncertainty. Inflation crept in, fuel lines grew longer. International companies began pulling out. And yet, there was no collapse. Why? Because something unusual was happening in Burkina Faso. As external support diminished, internal solidarity grew. Communities that had waited for solutions began creating their own. Towns formed civilian councils to manage security. Villagers built roads with their own hands. Teachers volunteered in areas without schools. What the world saw as failure, the people began to see as self-reliance. And Traoré encouraged it. Not with blind slogans, but with quiet support. He redirected military engineers to assist in building public infrastructure. He authorized the release of state land for local farming cooperatives. He used national broadcasts to highlight community achievements, not his own. His approach was not about building an empire, but awakening a society. Still, the dangers never left. Armed groups remained active. Explosions shattered morning markets. Soldiers died in ambushes. The state was still at war, and Traoré made no attempt to disguise it. "We are not safe," he said, "but we are awake, and that is more dangerous to our enemies than any weapon." His words struck a nerve, at home and abroad. To many Africans, especially the youth, he became more than a leader. He became proof that resistance was not madness, that reclaiming dignity was not impossible. Across borders, murals of his face began appearing. Songs were written in his name. His speeches were translated and shared on phones in villages he'd never visited. But to global strategists, this was a warning sign. A young, defiant, independent-minded leader gaining influence beyond his borders? That was a scenario they had seen before, and often not allowed to flourish. Yet Traoré's strength was in his unpredictability. He made no declarations of hostility. He launched no crusades. He simply refused to kneel. And that refusal, in a world used to compliance, became his most powerful weapon. In meetings with diplomats, he remained respectful, but clear. Burkina Faso is open to partnerships, but not ownership. He welcomed cooperation, but rejected control. He spoke with the calm of a man who knew the cost of every word. Behind him, the military remained largely loyal, not out of fear, but because he had earned their respect, not through rank, but through presence. He had bled beside them, marched with them, and made them feel seen. And yet, for all the admiration and momentum, a question hung in the air. How long could it last? Because in the history of Africa, there is a cruel pattern. Those who challenge the status quo often do not write the end of their own story. In the shadows of every revolution, there are whispers of betrayal, of danger, of endings written in advance. Traoré knew this. He knew that hope alone could not shield him from bullets. nor could sincerity guarantee survival. The corridors of power, both local and global, had long been stained with the fall of men who dared to think independently. He was not naive, but he was unafraid. Inside Burkina Faso, the strain was real. Resources were limited. The volunteer forces, while passionate, lacked proper equipment. Attacks continued, and each loss carved another scar into the fragile confidence of a recovering people. But what held them together was not perfection. It was purpose. They believed they were part of something bigger than themselves, something long denied to them, ownership of their own future. Traoré never presented himself as a messiah. His speeches carried no delusions of grandeur. Instead, he reminded his people of one truth. This land is ours, and only we can decide its fate. He pushed for reforms in education, calling for a curriculum that taught children not just about the world, but about themselves. History classes were rewritten to include local heroes, indigenous knowledge, and forgotten traditions. National pride was no longer abstract, it was practical. Young minds began to see that they came from strength, not silence. At the same time, Traoré's government sought to reinvigorate the agricultural sector. Not through foreign dependency, but through local resilience. He invited agronomists, engineers, and traditional farmers to collaborate. They experimented with climate-adapted crops, rebuilt irrigation systems, and restored lands once abandoned to dust. International experts scoffed. These are small gestures, some said, symbolic. But they missed the point. For decades, symbolism had belonged to foreign embassies and global banks. Now, the soil itself had become a symbol of resistance, of rebirth. Still, the battle was not only external. Within his own ranks, not everyone agreed with his methods. Some senior officers quietly grumbled. Some officials missed the comfort of predictability and the benefits of international aid. There were rumors of meetings behind closed doors, of doubts growing louder. But Traoré stayed his course. His answer to internal dissent was transparency. He invited criticism during televised panels. He published spending reports. He even opened military strategy sessions to civilian observers. In a region long haunted by secrecy, his openness was both refreshing and risky. Yet perhaps the boldest move of all was diplomatic. Instead of isolating himself in ideology, Traoré initiated a continental dialogue, not with bureaucrats or elite summits, but with the people, through town hall-style meetings broadcast across African countries. He posed difficult questions. What does African unity mean? What does sovereignty demand? What are we willing to sacrifice to build a continent that serves its own children? His words resonated. From Ghana to Chad, from Senegal to the DRC, youth groups began forming under names like Pan-African Voices and Traoré Generation. Not political parties, movements, not cults of personality, calls for agency. And that terrified some, because the most dangerous idea in the world is not rebellion, it is empowerment, a belief that ordinary people can change their conditions without permission from above. As intelligence reports began signaling coordinated disinformation campaigns and strange power outages hit critical infrastructure, it became clear his leadership had crossed a threshold. This was no longer about Burkina Faso. It was about the possibility that if one nation could reclaim its agency, others might follow. Still, Traoré didn't blink. In every speech, his tone remained steady. "We are not at war with the world," he said. "We are simply reclaiming our right to breathe freely in it." And while the storms gathered, inside the country something extraordinary was happening. Burkina Faso, once known only in crisis headlines, was now speaking with its own voice. Quiet, firm, and unbroken. By mid-2023, something undeniable had taken root in Burkina Faso. Not stability in the conventional sense, not prosperity measured by foreign indexes, but a kind of awakening. A collective realization that the old ways were not returning and that this new path, uncertain, difficult, defiant, was now their own. Traoré, still only in his mid-30s, had become the most talked about African leader in underground circles, in village courtyards alike. Yet the burden he carried grew heavier by the day. Each decision was a tightrope walk between defiance and survival. Each speech a gamble between inspiration and escalation. He spent less time in ceremonial offices and more in the field, quietly visiting schools built by local hands, inspecting farms recovering from drought, and listening, always listening, to the voices that had long been ignored. His presence wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. He knew that trust, once broken, must be rebuilt inch by inch. At night, he met with advisors, not in luxury chambers but in repurposed barracks, where conversations were blunt and plans uncertain. And still, he pressed forward. One of the most daring shifts came not from his military strategy, but from his approach to language and identity. Traoré began championing the use of indigenous languages in schools and media, not as a rejection of French or global communication, but as a revival of something deeper: dignity through voice. Colonization didn't only take our resources, he once said, it replaced our reflection with someone else's mirror. He believed that until people could name their dreams in their own tongue, they would always remain visitors in their own skin. Of course, such moves were seen by some foreign observers as populist, or worse, provocative. But to those on the ground, it felt like truth. Meanwhile, regional dynamics were shifting. The Sahel, once dismissed as an ungovernable zone of instability, had become the epicenter of a new ideological contest. Who would define African security? Foreign troops or local resistance? Who would own African development? External investors or internal resilience? Traoré leaned toward the latter, but not blindly. He formed joint task forces with neighboring nations, focusing not on projecting power, but protecting communities. He understood that success in Burkina Faso meant little if chaos spilled in from beyond its borders. The region had to rise together or fall divided. Critics called it naive. Supporters called it visionary. But for Traoré, it was simply necessary. Back home, his reforms began to bear fruit, not in grand announcements, but in quiet changes. A road connecting once isolated towns completed ahead of schedule. Local grain stores reporting surplus for the first time in years. Youth literacy programs expanding without foreign grants. Still, the threats persisted. Drone footage showed militant movements near borders. Economic pressure intensified. Foreign corporations filed legal complaints over canceled contracts. Media narratives shifted from curiosity to caution. The term militarized populism began appearing in international briefings. But within Burkina Faso, fear began to recede. Not disappear, just recede. People walked at night in towns where gunfire used to dictate curfews. Schools reopened in regions once considered lost. The flag, once a mere symbol, was now something people wore, carried, painted on walls, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. And yet, through all this, Traoré remained unusually reserved. He avoided long interviews. He declined awards. He refused to frame himself as a savior. If I become the story, he said, then the people become the silence again. Perhaps that was his most radical act of all, not to command attention, but to redirect it. Because in a world where power often demands the spotlight, he chose the shadows of purpose. And in doing so, he became a mirror for something far bigger than himself. The closer Burkina Faso moved towards self-reliance, the more visible the invisible forces became. Not all threats carry rifles. Some come dressed in suits, holding contracts, or broadcast through satellite signals with polished accents and curated narratives. Traoré understood that modern conflict doesn't always take place on battlefields. It plays out in banks, media feeds, supply chains. And so his defense was not just military. It was psychological, cultural, and structural. A war of perception. He spoke less about enemies, more about clarity. We do not hate, he said. We simply choose not to obey systems that do not serve us. Yet even this measured resistance drew fire. Global institutions warned of instability. Financial ratings were downgraded. Influential commentators spoke of Burkina Faso as a nation adrift, as if choosing one's own direction were somehow a form of danger. But inside the country, a different kind of danger had receded, the danger of hopelessness. In cities and rural provinces alike, people began to organize not around fear, but around function. Local councils managed irrigation. Youth groups patrolled streets abandoned by overstretched security forces. Women's cooperatives reopened shuttered markets. It wasn't perfect, but it was purposeful. Traoré encouraged these efforts not with grand decrees, but with quiet reinforcement. A leader present but not overpowering. He visited a school, not to speak, but to sit among students and listen. He spent hours with displaced families, not for cameras, but to understand what rebuilding truly meant. His leadership was not built on charisma, but on closeness. And that's what made it dangerous to those who prefer distant rulers and predictable alliances. Because what Traoré represented was not a rebellion, it was an alternative, a working model of bottom-up governance in a region long dominated by top-down dictates. He didn't shut out the world. He simply invited it in on new terms. Trade with neighbors increased. Cultural exchanges resumed. Young Burkinabés traveled abroad, not to escape, but to learn and return. Still, there were whispers of plots, foreign agents, sleeper cells, not confirmed, but not dismissed. The line between paranoia and precaution blurred. And through it all, Traoré walked steadily, never declaring victory, never claiming immunity from failure. He often quoted a proverb, "When the roots are deep, there is no reason to fear the wind." But he also knew that roots can be poisoned, slowly, quietly, over time. That's why his final move in 2024 shocked many. He announced the formation of an independent council of elders and civic leaders to oversee government accountability, including his own office. No previous head of state in the region had voluntarily given up such power. Critics said it was performative. Supporters said it was revolutionary. To Traoré, it was necessary, because if the movement were to outlive him, it needed structure, not just ideals. He often said, "Charisma fades, systems endure, build the system." So the council was formed. Its members included village chiefs, youth organizers, religious leaders, and even former critics. They were not chosen for loyalty, but for their ability to challenge him when needed. It was a gamble, but one grounded in trust. And then, something remarkable happened. Other countries began to notice. Delegations quietly visited Ouagadougou, not just to negotiate contracts, but to understand how a war-torn, resource-limited nation had begun building a model rooted in humility and collective will. They didn't come seeking grand theories. They came to observe practice. Meanwhile, across social media platforms, a new wave emerged. Young Africans sharing blueprints from Burkina Faso, not as dogma, but as inspiration. Budget templates, community defense strategies, education initiatives, not political manifestos, living documents. Because the change was no longer a story, it was becoming a system. And at the heart of it remained a leader who knew he would not always be there. And perhaps that's why it worked. Because real leaders don't build monuments to themselves. They build tools for others to use after they're gone. By the end of 2024, a quiet certainty had settled over Burkina Faso. Not that the battles were over, they weren't. Not that all wounds had healed, they hadn't. But that something irreversible had begun. And at the center of it all, Ibrahim Traoré remained. A soldier in posture, a listener in practice, and a mirror in meaning. He had become a symbol not just of change, but of possibility. That a man with no dynasty, no wealth, and no global backing could shift the direction of an entire country through presence, principle, and persistence. But the burden of being a symbol is heavy, and it doesn't come with rest. Behind closed doors, his team grew weary. The stress of constant pressure, security risks, sabotage attempts, and relentless scrutiny began to show. Yet Traoré refused to vanish behind guarded gates. He lived with the same discipline he had when he was a captain. Meals with soldiers, meetings under dim lights, often walking without announcement through marketplaces just to hear the unfiltered voice of his people. And that voice, once filled with despair, now carried a new sound: responsibility. For that, Traoré always gave the same message: don't wait for me. I'm not your answer. I'm your reminder. He never promised salvation. He promised the return of agency. And in a continent where too often leaders are worshipped and then resented, he chose to be something rarer: a transition. There were still assassination plots uncovered. Misinformation campaigns flooded social media. Foreign-funded groups lobbied for regime change under the guise of humanitarian concern. But nothing struck fear like the quiet determination of people who had tasted ownership. In a private interview that would only be released months later, Traoré was asked a final question. "Do you think you will survive this?" He paused, then replied, "Does it matter if the people survive me?" That was his vision. That was the revolution. Not grand speeches or giant statues, but a generation that no longer waited for heroes to save them. A generation that saw governance not as spectacle, but as service, not as foreign script, but as local authorship. And that, more than any army or economic plan, was the true transformation. Because what Traoré sparked wasn't just a shift in politics, it was a shift in consciousness. In a world that often told Africa to sit down, he stood up. And when they asked him to explain, he didn't shout. He simply pointed to the soil, the sun, and the people and said, "This is enough if we believe it." Years from now, historians may debate the outcomes. Economists may measure the growth. Politicians may rewrite the motives. But none of them will be able to erase what began with a captain, a question, and a choice. In Burkina Faso, the air had changed. Not because a man arrived, but because a people woke up. And no one, not even empires, can silence a people who have remembered their voice.